subscribe for more videos like this.
The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Just Chapter 1. Let's read it. Book 1, The Coming of the Martians. 1. The Eve of the War. No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. As most terrestrial, men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as our minds are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarding this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the great disillusionment. The planet Mars, I scarcely need the reminder to the reader, revolves around the sun at a mean distance of 140 million miles, and the light and heat it receives from the sun is barely half of that received by this world. It must be, if the nebular hypothesis has any truth, older than our world, and long before this earth ceased to be molten, life upon its surface must have begun its course. The fact it is scarcely 1/7 of the volume of the earth must have accelerated its cooling to the temperature at which life could begin. It is air and water and all that is necessary for the support of animated existence. Yet so vain is man, and so blindly by his vanity, that no writer, up to this very end of the 19th century, expressed any idea that intelligent life might have developed there far, or indeed at all, beyond its earthly level. Now was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area and remoter from the sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from time's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know now that even in its equatorial region, in midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. Its air is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk under their cover by 1/3 of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowscapes gather and melt about either pole and periodically inundate its temperature zones. That last stage of slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole. That last stage of exhaustion, which is to us is still incredibly remote, has been a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. The immediately pressure of necessity has brightened their intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamed of, they see, as its nearest distance of only 35 million of miles sunward of them, a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and gray with water, with a cloud atmosphere eloquent of fertility, with glimpses through its drifting cloud wisps of broad stretches of populous country, with narrow, navy-crowded seas. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as we are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone in its cooling, and this world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is, indeed, their only escape from the destruction that, generation after generation, creeps upon them. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its inferior races. The Tasmanians, in spite of their human likeness, were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain as if Martians warred in the same spirit? The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the by, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war, but failed to interpret the fluctuating appearance of the markings they mapped so well. All that time the Martians must have been getting ready. During the opposition of 1894, a great light was seen on the illuminated part of the disk, first at the Lick Observatory, then by Perrotin of Nice, then by other observers. English readers heard of it first in the issue of Nature dated August 2nd. I am inclined to think that it is a blaze that might have cast the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet, from which their shots were fired at us. Peculiar markings, as yet unexplained, were seen near to the site of the outbreak during the next two oppositions. The storm burst upon us 6 years ago now. As Mars approached opposition, a level of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange, palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. It occurred toward midnight of the 12th, and the spectroscope, to which he had once resorted, indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity toward this Earth. This jet of fire had become invisible about 12:15. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet, as flaming gases rush out of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went on with ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news, and in this the excess of his feelings invited me up to take a turn with him the night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that had happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor of the corner, steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaking across it. Ogilvy moved about, invisible but audible. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue and the little round planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a little thing, so bright and small and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes, and slightly flattened from the perfect round. But so little it was, so silvery warm, a pin's head of light. It was as if it quivered, but really this was the telescope vibrating with the activity of the clockwork that kept the planet in view. As I watched, the planet seemed to grow larger and smaller and to advance and recede, but that was simply that my eye was tired. 40 millions of miles it was from us, more than 40 millions of miles of void. Few people realize the immensity of vacancy in which the dust of the material universe swims. Near it in the field, I remember, were 3 faint points of light, 3 telescopic stars infinitely remote, and all around it was unfathomable darkness of empty space. You know how the blackness looks on a frosty starlit night. In a telescope it seems far profounder, and invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across the incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was so to bring so much struggle and calamity and death of the earth. I never dreamed of it then as I watched. No one on earth dreamed of that unerring missile. That night, too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it. a reddish flash at the edge of the slightest projection of the outline just as the chronometer struck midnight. And at that I told Ogilvy, and he took my place. The night was warm, and I was thirsty. I went stretching my legs clumsily, and I was feeling my way into the darkness to the little table where the siphon stood, while Ogilvy exclaimed at the stream of gas that came on towards us. That night another invisible missile started on its way to the Earth from Mars, just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. I remember how I sat on the table there in the blackness, with patches of green and crimson swimming before my eyes. I wished I had to light a smoke by, but suspecting the meaning of the minute and minute gleam I had seen, and all that it would presently bring me, Ogilvy watched till 1, and then gave up, until we lit the lantern and walked over to his house. Down below in the darkness of Ottershaw and Chertsey, and all their hundreds of people sleeping in peace. He was full of speculation that night about the condition of Mars, and scoffed at the vulgar idea of having its inhabitants who were signaling us. His idea was that meteorites might be falling in a heavier shower upon the planet, or that huge volcanic explosion was in progress. He pointed out to me unlikely how it was that the organic evolution had taken the same direction in the two adjacent planets. The chances against anything man-like on Mars are 1,000,000 to 1, he said. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night, and the night after about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Why the shot ceased after the 10th, no one on Earth has attempted to explain. It may be the gases, the firing caused by the Martians' inconvenience, dense clouds of smoke or dust visible through a powerful telescope on Earth, a little gray, fluctuating patches, spread through the clearness of the planet's atmosphere and obscured its more familiar features. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here, there, and everywhere concerning the volcanoes upon Mars. The Sari comic period Punch, I remember, made a happy use of it in the political cartoons, and all unsuspected those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace so many miles a second through the empty gulf of space, hour by hour and day by day, nearer and nearer. It seemed to me almost incredibly watching that, and wonderful that, with that swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. I remember how jubilant Markham was at securing new photographs of the planet for the illustrated paper he edited in those days. People in these latter times scarcely realized the abundance and enterprise of our 19th century papers. For my own part, I was much occupied in learning to ride the bicycle, and busy upon a series of papers discussing the probable developments of moral ideas as civilization progressed. One night, the first missile then could scarcely have been 10 million miles away. I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her and pointed out Mars, a bright dot of light creeping zenithward, toward which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Chertsey of Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses, and the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into the melody by the distance. My wife pointed out to me the brightness of the red, green, and yellow signal lights hanging in the framework against the sky. It seemed so safe and tranquil. And that's it. Chapter 1. And one only. From H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. Thanks for tuning in. Nanu Nanu.